We come to the second presentation of 2014. And the title for this year's presentations is the Parayana. Para means beyond, or in this regard, in Sanskrit, it means across. It means bridging something that is a limitation or a gulf or a hiatus, and being able to bridge that. And yana is the way. So that one of the best translations of Parayana is the way across. And the original use of the Parayana, as we mentioned last week, came when they were recounting after not the death of the Buddha so much, it was called the parinirvana of the Buddha. And he was about 80 years old. And he lay down on his right side and passed. And there was a great deal of sorrow. In fact, the classic illustration of that, which I will bring next week, is that even the animals are crying. And everyone is just, the light has gone out of the world. And then the realization was that the light has gone out of all the worlds. And on deeper contemplation, it was realized that his basic teaching towards the end of his earthly career of teaching, he taught for 45 years, nonstop, all the time, every day. It takes a tremendous amount of not just stamina, but it takes a peculiar kind of continuity to be able to do that. The continuity is one that is not a lineage of adding up the presentations, adding up the days, the weeks, the months, the years. As Shelley said in his great poem, days, months, weeks, they are the rags of time. But time, when it is purified to its first dimension, it is the primal dimension. It is spontaneously emergent out of the zero field of nature, but it was a fertile emptiness. It was a fertile zero that was spontaneously able to emerge energy, which registered itself as time. And as soon as time registered in its emergence, it instantly, because now there were instants, instantly blossoms into space. So that when Einstein began to theorize in the early 20th century on the Minkowski universe, where there was a fabric of time and space, he began to understand that that fabric was space-time and had a quality where whatever would come within space-time further would rest in the fabric of space-time, and that the more thusness that it had, the more it would impinge on space-time, on its fabric. And so for most of the universe, where there is more than just time blossomed into space, where there is phenomenality, where there is existence, that existence will curve space-time. So that the curvature of space-time is correspondent to its weight of phenomenality, its weight of existence. And the usual term of its weight is in terms of its gravity. And it was apparent in some of Einstein's math that if the gravity is immense, the distortion, the curvature of space-time will be so radical that given enough gravitational weight, it will sink a well into the fabric of space-time so that you have what later on was discovered and was indeed called by John A. Wheeler a black hole. That it is so heavy that space-time is curved in upon itself. It's not that it disappears or it's gone, it's just that what disappears is the phenomenality of it being able to emit light, to emit photons. And without the particles called photons, which is the carrier of electromagnetic spectrum energy, that phenomenal energy will not produce light. It will be darkness. It will be a curvature that has gone not just full circle, but full sphere. And so the black hole will still have its gravity. It's a tremendous weight in the rest of time-space, but it will not emit photons. What it does emit, though, is something that Stephen Hawking came up with, and it's called Hawking radiation, which occurs always in pairs. And we've come to understand that Lao Tzu and his Tao Te Ching, where he said, what cannot be spoken of as the Tao is Tao, but what can be spoken of at its deepest, it's paired. And we understand now in the early 21st century that the pairedness generally is symmetrical. And so the symmetry is so strong that it exceeds the curving of something in upon itself to become darkness, like a black hole. Nevertheless, it still has its gravity, and that there then is the understanding that something which is invisible in the universe but has gravity, that its original field is more subtle, is of a higher dimension than black holes even, and gravity even. And so while there is a darkness which still has gravity, there is a field of origin out of which even gravity occurs, and it's that field out of which space occurs, it's that field out of which time occurs, and the space is the precursor of matter, which is the phenomenality of existence, but it is preceded instantly, as it were, by time, and time is emerged not instantly, not causally, but spontaneously out of formlessness. The Sanskrit word for that is shunyata. And shunyata pairs in a grand symmetry with what does occur, and occurs such that we occur as that, and the Sanskrit word for that is tathata. tathata. So that tathata and shunyata are not just a symmetrical pair, but they're a supersymmetry. And we know now from string theory and from other highfalutin, high dharma mathematics that supersymmetry has a very peculiar way which beggars understanding. Our logical systems cannot comprehend that. Our minds, which are trying to school themselves into those logical systems, cannot countenance it at all. And the polite way to say it used to be that it's a mystery. Or to skirt the issue, the almost impolite ways to say it's magic. Oh, that's magic. It is beyond, it is on the other shore from where there's even mystery or magic. And the Buddha talked about how nirvana is the completeness on this shore, but that there is an other shore. And crossing over to that other shore, the death experience is cushioned contextually by a whole cycle of something superior to life, which is a rebirth back again into life. But that there is a further triple high dharma context in which even rebirth no longer needs to reoccur. That not only is there a nirvana, but there's like a superstring high dharma nirvana, where the realization is not a realization anymore, but is simply real. The qualities of the Parayana is to cross over by a way. A way, yana in Sanskrit, connotates a vehicle. There's something within which a vehicle that one is able to go on the way. And in the way that yana first came into play was because of the origins of a very powerful architect who had high dharma elicited and brought out of him, and that was St. Thomas. Didymus Judas Thomas, Thomas the twin, the doubting Thomas, one of the disciples of Jesus, the living Jesus. And we talked about how Thomas was an architect probably in Damascus, ancient Damascus, in Syria, and was enormously interested in a special kind of spiritual architecture, and would have become acquainted with the father of Jesus, Joseph, who was not just a carpenter, but everything that ensued from that. Joseph was not only in charge of doing what carpenters do to make furniture or wood frames or everything up to architecture, up to making buildings, up to making many other things, which required getting the origin of wood, which is trees. And the best trees for really high, important architecture were the cedars of Lebanon. And there was a great connection with the king of the Phoenicia that included what is today Lebanon and all of the cedars. And his seat of power, his name was Hiram, his seat of power, his royal palace, was in a coastal city called Tyre, Tyre. And there was this tremendous ability in Tyre to use the cedars of Lebanon to compose in an adjunct city called Sidon, to compose those great cedars of Lebanon into the kind of planks that could be positioned and put together in the architecture not of buildings but of ships. And so in Sidon, the first really great ships were made. And they were made under direction of the king of Tyre, because it was the Tyrian explorers and navy, as it were, which had gone out, far out on the Mediterranean Sea, by far out not only 100 miles offshore or 1,000 miles offshore, but had gone all the way through 2,000 miles of the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar and out into the Atlantic Ocean. By 1000 BC. Eventually, the Phoenician trading colonies, because they were not colonies that were established on the land, the Tyrians were too smart to know you don't take land away from other people, but what you do is you make a lease on some island that's offshore by which you can come and dock your boats with their goods, and you can trade to get their goods and take them away and then return in this cycle. And so the Phoenician use of offshore islands was cued because Tyre itself was of that archetypal shape. The power of Tyre, its shipping, wealth, and they were really wealthy, but also its great courage to go sailing into the Atlantic Ocean 3,000 years ago. They went as far south on the west coast of Africa as the Cameroons, that's near Nigeria. Senegal, which is a little sliver of country that's in that Nigerian, Cameroon area, it has an offshore island called Gorée, and that was one of the farthest African ports of the Tyrians. And Gorée was the place in which all the great commerce took place for thousands of years. And oddly enough, when the product of that region of Africa that became the most lucrative, that was the slave trade. And so the slaves were herded off the continent of Africa and incarcerated into holding pens and prisons on Gorée. And there they were collected by great ships that carried them off to wherever the slaves were going to be marketed and sold. And so there arose a bastardization of the wonderful facility and powers of Tyre, of Sidon, of the cedars of Lebanon, of that whole region, of which the largest trade city going east was Damascus. Damascus and Aleppo on near the coast, but Damascus was really the great trade city, and it was there that St. Thomas was from. And one of his close friends, almost a spirit companion, was named Thaddeus. And both Thomas and Thaddeus were disciples, 2 of the 12 disciples of Jesus. And they were from that area and spoke those languages, all of the trade languages, so that later on, when disciples were sent out after the crucifixion and then resurrection of Jesus, after a while, the disciples were sent out to spread the word, to distribute the way. Jesus always called his, not just the teaching, but the way. The way. This is the way. Not a doctrine, not an ideology. It wasn't a religio, a binding. It wasn't a religion. It was the way. It was a yana. It was a vehicle of endeavor which is shareable on whatever population or whatever distribution of population that there is. Nothing else comes to divide the way, and nothing else divides the yana. And so the Parayana is a refinement that was waiting in the wings that came in with the Mahayana. And it was St. Thomas who began with the seed of the way of the living Jesus that became the great way, the Mahayana, in India. He landed at Kerala on the south coast, the Malabar coast of the pointing tip of India, and had been invited by the king of one of the great Greco-Indian kingdoms. The king was named Gandophares. Phares is actually a name of honor that's derived from the ancient Iranians. There are many so-and-so Phares. This Gandophares had written a letter to the living Jesus to send someone to build him a suitable palace for his kingdom, also among all the other languages that they spoke and wrote. Greek was the basic language that united them with the western part of the world, and he wanted somebody who knew Greek and was a good architect and could build him a suitable palace to reach out to many different people. Thomas, of course, went from Kerala by ship up the coast of India, all the way to the Indus River and up the Indus River to the place at which Gandophares had his capital, and that area was called in ancient times Gandhara. And it was a place where Greek kings had ruled since the time of Alexander the Great. Thomas got to India in 41 AD. By the time he got to Gandhara, it was about 42 AD. And by that time, almost 300 years of Indo-Greek kings had reigned. And those Indo-Greek kings were distributed all through not only North India, but wherever Alexander had gone, especially into Central Asia. And so the more powerful Gandharian Indo-Greek kings always wanted to extend their kingdoms so that they went into Central Asia. And Gandophares, while he was trying to conquer in Central Asia for a year and came back, he found that Thomas had not built a palace for him. He said, "What have you done with the money?" And he said, "I have distributed it to all the people, who now are the people, are your palace." And he threw Thomas into prison. And while he was there, wondrous miracle things happened. That one of the jailed people was very famous for knowing about South India, not the Malabar coast, but on the other east coast. And the big coming city there was, for many, many centuries, called Madras. It's now called Chennai. And Madras was uniting the Tamil people of the very southern tip of India in an interface with those going a little bit more to the north. And so Madras became one of the great international ports of the ancient world, and very sophisticated as one would find in Damascus or in Alexandria or in Rome, wherever many kinds of people were doing business with scores of different kinds of people and were amazingly refined. One of my really good friends in San Francisco was a Madrasi, and I remember inviting him and his wife to a little dinner. I had a cottage I was renting up in the Oakland Hills near an old college there. And I had invited my Chinese professor, Kai Shu, and his French wife. And when they came, they realized that they were both internationally savvy about all kinds of things. And it was hard not to listen and to get a word in edgewise because they knew all kinds of things. And when I got to Calgary, Alberta, one of the first persons I met was Professor Ranbir Vora, who was from Madras, and his wife, Meena, who was the greatest cook in the world. And I asked her one time, I said, Meena, why do you not write a cookbook? She said, I don't know what I'm doing. I go by smell and taste, and I don't know from one meal to the next. I just do it. That's a Madrasi. That's the refinement. That's the high Dharma. There is no plan. Plan? There is no plan. We're busy. We're busy exploring that how to do it will spontaneously emerge in time, which will be fertile enough to generate the space within which phenomenality and existence can occur. And so, for the Parayana of 2014, there is no plan, but it will occur, and spontaneously. The Mahayana that Thomas seeded became a reality in terms of a written book. And the author of that was Ashvaghosha, who, when he was born as a very clever Brahmin who was like a super lawyer, he could argue anything, and Asva in Sanskrit, as I mentioned last week, is horse, and Gosha is the horse neighing. So he has the tremendous power of the horse in action, ready to go. And Ashvaghosha, his classic first book in the Mahayana is called the Shraddhopada Mahayana, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. And Shraddha, as faith, in Greek, faith is pistis. And you've all heard of faith, hope, and charity. The actual layering of it is faith, charity, hope. There is an audacity to hope because it's like a thrice greatest. It begins with faith and it becomes distributed through charity. In Sanskrit, charity is the word for it is dana, dana. And the first perfection. The first paramita, which is perfection. The first of the 6 paramitas is dana. It means givingness, giftingness. Not just giving, but gifting. And dana begins the perfection that eventually becomes the high dharma. But in order to do it, one needs to have not just the dana, but one needs to have also a quality called sila in Sanskrit. And it means that it is patiently endeavoring. The paramita for that is kashanti. The faithfully endeavoring is endeavoring in a continuity, not in some kind of a causality. You're endeavoring because of or to get to. It's just endeavoring. And kashanti is that patience, and that patience owes its original understanding to the book of Job in the Old Testament. And the book of Job is not like an ancient book. It's not a Mosaic book. It's not part of the Pentateuch. It's not like Genesis, Exodus, etc., etc. It's not a part of the prophets. It has a quality that cites it with the Megillah, which is the 5 wisdom books, but the book of Job is almost by itself. In fact, the only other book in the Old Testament that is similar in the sense of related to it is the book of Daniel. Because the author of the book of Job was also the author of the book of Daniel and was author of a book that only exists in fragments, which was the book of Noah. And Noah, Job, and Daniel were the 3 archetypal just men in the eyes of God. They were present with the angel of the presence that constantly is there in the presence of God. And the author of these, we do not know his name, but he most certainly was born and raised in Alexandria, and was raised in Alexandria in the later 200s BC. And by the time that he had written the book of Job and written the book of Noah, he had a council of those who surrounded him, who amplified what he was able to write, what he was able to impart, what he was able to share. And they went from Alexandria back to Palestine, back to Jerusalem, back to Judea. And they became the seed that developed as the Essenes. And the Essenes were the active life, whereas in Alexandria, the symmetry, the supersymmetry to the Essenes were the healers, the therapeutes, the therapeutai, those who by contemplation healed all. Whereas the Essenes made sure that the ancient writings were fulfilled, that they were purified, that their lives were purified, that they were able to live as a community that was trustworthy to pass on the writings, the teachings, in embodiment in the way of living purely, and that some of those Essenes who were not marginal, but who were intermediate with Alexandria, with the contemplatives, were able to marry. And Joseph's father, Jesus' father Joseph, was one of the marrying semi-Essenes, semi-therapeutes. And when the newborn Jesus was threatened by the insane jealousy, the old Herod increasingly was mad. He killed, sacrificed his two best sons because he suspected they were trying to kill him to take over. They were going to take over anyway, but they were trying to kill him, so he killed them. And he's the one who ordered every infant male under 2 years old be slaughtered, because he was told by the 3 traveling magi who had come bearing gifts to witness the birth by the stars. The star had risen and a universal king was being born. In Sanskrit, in ancient times, what was understood is that in supersymmetry to a Buddha is a universal king. In Sanskrit, the name of a universal king is a Chakravartin. The chakras, but this is a master, a Chakravartin of all the chakras that there are and all of their powers. And this Chakravartin is able to bring them not through the integral of the chakras, or even the massive integral of the set of the chakras, but to a distillation of the whole meaningfulness and capacity to have new chakras that come into being, because a Chakravartin or a Buddha in their supersymmetry have brought this out of reality into time, into space, into existence, and that this is something that transcends mystery farther than mystery transcends does the chicken or the egg come first. Let's take a break. Let's come back. We're looking at an enormous scalar. We're looking at the swath of the world resonated, and resonated several times over. One of the deepest resonances was when written language came into play. And written language that one has to be able to write. And it was very rare for a man or a woman to be able to be literate, to be able to read and write, over 6,000 years ago. But there were men and women who learned to read and write. The males largely were called scribes. The females largely were hidden behind the scenes, but behind the scenes they were literate in the sense that they could tell among the children which of those boys and girls, in a feminine wisdom way, had the propensity to be encouraged to begin reading and writing. And so the women used their reading and writing behind the scenes, and the scribes farmed out their capacities largely to royals. And so the scribes became those who eventually became the lawyers, who read and write to service those who are royally rich, etc., powerful because of that. And they have an adjunct called the court, and there are officers of the law called the police, and they are all under the pyramidal pecking order of the judges headed by the supreme judges, and that this is the judicial branch of government, and the tyranny now is not from the executive or the legislative, but from the judicial branch. We live under a judicial tyranny. You can go to jail if you can't pay someone to keep you out. There are so many laws on the books. You can be gotten at any time for infractions you never even knew, especially in 2014. There are like 10,000 new laws applicable now. You can't possibly watch out. But the wisdom of the women is more and more intact as the scribal, legal eagle nature of the men bastardizes the key for civilization, which is being able to read and write. And to read and write means that one can have meaningful clusters, not only of people, but of what they do. And so eventually, within 1,000 years, the origin of written language is about 4350 BC. By 3350 BC, written language had constellated very much larger groups of men and women, of human beings, and they became the prototypes of the cities. And by that time, there was a recognition that civitas, civilization, was because of the cities. But the deeper wisdom was that it was language that is the real thread of civilization. The being able not only to read and write and to live in cities, but a tremendous shift came about 4000 BC, about 6,000 years ago. There were enough men and women who tended to pair together so that there were couples. And the archetypal couple is Adam and Eve, who ate from the tree of knowledge. They learned to read and write. And they learned that just being au naturel was not really enough. One had to cover up. One had to wear skins. Clothing was the first sign that they were needing to live beyond nature. No more au naturel. No more wandering around naked, or one now was not just naked, one was nude. One had to cover up. And that this was mythically the image sociale, where one understood you couldn't stay in Eden anymore in the natural state. And so Adam and Eve were not exiled from Eden. They walked out in search of places that would be new to them, where they could be clothed in keeping with the resonances that were coming out of their reading and writing and living and exploring and pairing and bringing out of the fertile zero field of nature, not a formlessness that was helpless and negligible and negating, but was fertile. And so the spontaneity that came, and one recognized that there was a field, not just a fertile zero field, but one went out and became acquainted with the startling revealing that there was another field, a field of consciousness, and that the field of consciousness was a fertile infinite field. And that infinite field was at home and accepted by the natural field, so that the infinite and the zero were both very happily in complementarity, and that gave rise to the high Dharma. That gave rise to the Parayana. Going beyond, going across what would have been a gulf of formlessness into a new spontaneity that worked the zeros into what was and revealed the infinities that were really there then. One of the things that happened when quantum electrodynamics began to have a math in the late 1940s that was powerful enough to write it, to be able to have some who could read that writing and understand the quantum electrodynamics, the QED, that the previous understanding was deeply limited and thus flawed and needed to be not just replaced, but the entire mathematique needed to be recalibrated. And one of the geniuses that emerged at that time was Richard Feynman, who realized it isn't just that the zeros and infinities need to be brought into play. The equations that were trying to predict what would happen on the subatomic level, on the quantum level, were constantly turning up infinities in the equations, in the math. And so most people got around it by doing a caveat. We will not deal with exactness anymore. We will deal with probabilities. And so probability theory came into play. In economics, it was John Maynard Keynes. In mathematics, it was Johnny von Neumann. And so the whole thing about probability brought in the fact that the strategy that really works with this non-specific, non-perfect, non-exact mathematic is that in probabilities, one now deals with a situation of a game. And so game theory got born in the early 1940s and achieved its magisterial form by John von Neumann, who not only was a math genius, but he was one of the 5 Hungarians. They were called the Martians of the new science. And his classic book on game theory with one of his friends was published by Princeton in 1946. And it was applied not just to economics and not just to society, but to military, corporate control. And what came into play was not an empire, but something that succeeds very quietly what empires fail to deliver, and that is a feudal society. When Rome fell was the beginnings of the feudal society, not just of the Middle Ages, but what was used to be called correctly the Dark Ages. No one, except a very select few, were encouraged to, were allowed to, were finally under punishment, abated temporarily as long as you work for us allowed to learn to read and write. Everyone else became illiterate in the sense that they declined back to a quality, sociologically it's called serfdom. Serfdom is not just slavery from which you can be remitted, but serfdom you cannot. Your mother plowing the field dropped you in the field, and you will drop in that field when it comes your turn to die. That's serfdom. Ensuring that is an ideological construct that gets its authority because it has co-opted the mythic quality of language, oral language. You are not allowed to say, you're not allowed to speak, not just to anyone, even to yourself, such and such and so, and thus on and on. Never mind that you can't read and write, you also can't talk. You can't hear. There is no one who has ears to hear anymore. The Satan loves that. The Satan in Hebrew, the article is always accompanied with the name because it's not a male or female, it's a neuter. Neutered. It's not anyone. It's not a meeting of the genders into complexity, it's a neutering of genders into digitalized serfdom robotics that is predictable, especially by game theory. So if you inculcate and addict the population into games, playing games, especially the young males playing games, the younger the better. The population that doesn't play games so much are the females. Because they talk. They listen. And when there are no men to talk to, they talk with each other. They listen to each other. They listen to the children. They learn the children how to talk. They listen to the children, and this carries over. And you don't have to be particularly a mother to do this. Being around women, being around children brings this about. It's a quality where wisdom has a feminine gender to it, almost worldwide, in the sense that it is the wiseness of being able not only to read between the lines, but to hear between the words. To hear and to be able, in that listening, to occasionally refine it so that one is not listening to what is in between words or in between sentences or even in between vowels. One begins to hear silence. And when we are refined enough to be familiar and at home listening to silence, spontaneously, what occurs is everything. It's no longer limited to gates, stargates or whatever. It's the entire complementary field of consciousness and nature at play in the fields of the Lord. Then one gets, as Ashvaghosha writes in the Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, about 90 AD, about the time that St. John wrote the Apocalypse, about the time that the Grail was returned from the west of Britain to Antioch. They couldn't return it to St. John. He was imprisoned on Patmos. But they stopped by Ephesus and picked up from his place that was still preserving the sketches that his mentor for many years, Mary Magdalene, had made, the sketches of the young Jesus, of the mature Jesus, of St. John as a young man, of his brother, St. James, who was killed. He was beheaded by King Agrippa when he was just in his early 30s. All of these portraits were collected and taken with the cup, and taken and finally found a place in Antioch where there was enough of a community of the way in which there was a sheath for the cup made of the portraits of what was available, and portraits of Peter and Paul and Luke. And she had not done the portrait of Mark, the older Mark. He was not very tall. He was about 5'4", kind of burly, and long beard and hair. He looked leonine, looked lion-like. That sheath held the cup, which held a couple of quarts, about a liter of wine, enough to fill not all the glasses, but you diluted it with water because it was concentrated. It was costly to ship. And so the wine was poured, and then the water was poured to make the wine. And the water pourer was 10-year-old Mark, John Mark, who became Saint Mark, on the second story of his parents' home in Jerusalem. His mother was Mary, one of the four sisters of Jesus, and his father was from originally the island of Cyprus, where his brother, named son of Nabas, their father was named Nabas, so he was called Barnabas. And those were the parents of Mark. This is what Ashvaghosha wrote, having matured and grown the seed of St. Thomas through an intermediary. His name was Parshva, who's the one that converted Ashvaghosha from the arrogant Brahmin, expert lawyer, arguing about religious truths, into realizing that there is something beyond what can be posited as truths. What is the Mahayana? It is the soul of all sentient beings that constitutes all things in the world, phenomenal and super-phenomenal. Through and through this soul, we can disclose what the Mahayana signifies, because the soul in itself, involving the quintessence, the fifth essence of the Mahayana. 1, 2, 3, 4. Consciousness is the fifth essence. It's the thumb of the hand. It makes it possible to do things you were never able to do before, like writing and reading. It becomes, in its relative or transitory aspect, through the law of causation, birth and death. That limitation in Sanskrit is called samsara. That samsara is much more powerful than karma. Karma has a pair, the translated word for it is merit. But samsara is the whole world in which those who are trying to get for other reasons merit and trying to avoid for skittish good reasons karma become those who are enmeshed in an ideology. Those who are not clever enough, powerful enough to get into ideological entrapment fall into a mythic, increasingly beggared, reduced mythic horizon of what one talks about with everyone who is talking about to you, what one talks about, and the common denominator subsides, like the scale of Twitter or Facebook slowly subsiding into this dull mediocrity of allness with a ness sizzling in it, which is based upon an increasingly dominated ritual base, a comportment of what people do, how they do it, becomes more and more limited. Everyone does this. This is how you do that to get this. That links with this, and that does this. And increasingly, one gets what Feynman came to in the late 1940s. One gets a gibberish of the attempt to deal out the infinities, so that then you only deal with probabilities, you only deal with the game, with even just the theory games. And you just ignore all the infinities that come up in the math. He developed his own new written mathematic. They're called Feynman diagrams, where what comes in to play does such and such, and what comes out is so and so. And that one can learn to read not only in between, but beyond, in the sense of before and way after, the harmonic of what one is dealing with, including the infinities. So that there's a spontaneity, a spontaneous recognition through this recalibration of how to deal with the unknown. It's important because we had a classic example of the unknown in December of 1972, the last of the Apollo missions that were allowed, Apollo 17, touched down on the moon, and the last man on the moon wrote his book called The Last Man on the Moon. His signature reads, Gene Cernan. This is what happened on the moon when we were told that this would be it, no more. This is what a tall Texan jet fighter, space-seasoned, space cowboy wrote. Dreams really do come true. 4 hours after landing on the moon and wearing the backpack that contained my life support system, I wriggled backwards through the tiny hatch, got to my knees on the small porch, and cautiously descended Challenger's ladder, a rung at a time, until I stood on the saucer-like footpad. The sun glared bright all around as I had my first good look at the vast emptiness, while the canopy of sky remained thickly black from horizon to horizon, a contradiction that played, how can this be, with my logical mind? No fear, no apprehension, but a tremendous sense of satisfaction and accomplishment welled within me. My size 10.5 boot was poised just inches above the surface of this almost mythical land that mankind had watched so closely for uncounted aeons, and to which we had assigned properties ranging from religious icon and symbol of romance to maker of werewolves and clock for the harvest. Every night of my life it had been up there patiently waiting for my visit. I lowered my left foot and the thin crust gave way. Soft contact. There, it was done. A Cernan boot print was on the moon. As I stepped off the surface of Taurus Littrow, he said over his comm, I'd like to dedicate the first steps of Apollo 17 to all those who made it possible. I called to Houston and added, oh my golly, it's unbelievable. More next week.